Bună seara, bun găsit, bun venit, vă spun din nou cu toată afecțiunea mea creștină tuturor, bun venit pe pagina mea de Facebook, sunt onorat să vă am împreună cu oaspetele meu din seara aceasta. Pe pagina mea de Facebook, când vom discuta un subiect inedit, niciodată nu am discutat pe pagina mea de Facebook subiectul acesta. Este un subiect care îl vom discuta dintr-o perspectivă a sociologiei și are de a face cu consecințele acestui nou fenomen care de aproximativ 20 de ani bântuie prin întreaga lume și anume căsătoriile între persoane de același sex. Voi discuta subiectul acesta din perspectiva impactului pe care acest fenomen social nou, relativ minuscul, am putea spune, în istoria omenirii, îl are asupra copiilor, a celor mai fragili, a celor mai inocenți, membrii ai speciei umane, ai familiei umane și a societății. În seara aceasta îl voi avea ca oaspete pentru a discuta acest subiect un sociolog de prestigiu, un sociolog de renume mondial. Este vorba de domnul profesor de sociologie Mark Regnerus din Statele Unite și această conversație va avea loc în limba engleză. Înainte de a începe discuția mea cu domnul profesor, vreau să spun câteva cuvinte introductive privind subiectul din seara aceasta. Sociologia este un câmp de cercetare extrem de important, mai ales în aceste zile, când valorile sunt bulversate și când valorile se schimbă de la zi la zi. Și mai ales în contextul zilelor noastre, când e bine să cunoaștem ceea ce s-a întâmplat în trecut, ceea ce sociologii au descoperit, și ceea ce trebuie să știm privind viitorul și în care direcție ne ducem ca societate. Cuvântul sociologie vine, așa cum e ușor de înțeles, de la cuvântul societate, care înseamnă studiul societății și în principal studiul instituțiilor sociale, a relațiilor dintre oameni. Unii sociologi, de exemplu, susțin că societatea și instituțiile sociale sunt determinate în mod concret și ireversibil de anumite legi sociale imuabile care nu se pot schimba. Familia și căsătoria, relația dintre oameni, sunt unele din instituțiile sociale pe care sociologii le studiază. Dacă ar fi să dăm crezare acestei perspective, ar însemna că familia și căsătoria sunt determinate de anumite legi naturale, sociale, nescrise și imuabile. În consecință, societatea nu le poate schimba, nu le poate modifica și nici nu este îngăduit să le schimbe. Acest adevăr este mai direct și relevant pentru noi creștinii care credem în instituirea de către Dumnezeu a familiei și căsătoriei, cea mai veche, fundamentală și prima instituție socială din istoria omenirii. Mileniul nou redefinește legile sociologiei și ale instituțiilor sociale. Căsătoriile între persoanele de același sex, concubinajul ca normă socială, familia socială în loc de familia biologică sunt doar câteva exemple care dovedesc schimbările intenționate făcute de omul postmodern în revizuirea instituțiilor sociale. Aceste modificări însă au consecințe. Aceste consecințe nu sunt puține, dar sunt și dăunătoare. Deci voi discuta acest aspect al acestor modificări majore în redefinirea familiei și a căsătoriei cu domnul profesor de sociologie în seara aceasta. Cum spuneam la început, este vorba de un sociolog de renume mondial. Eu personal nu sunt sociolog, am studiat sociologia în universitate, am luat 2-3 cursuri și am multe de învățat și voi avea multe de învățat în ceea ce va spune domnul profesor în seara aceasta. Citesc cu atenție studiile sociologice și în măsura în care pot le explic în limba română și distribui aceste materiale celor care mă urmăresc pe Facebook și așa mai departe. Cum spuneam în primăvară, când am avut primul interviu în limba engleză cu colegul meu din Strasburg, Gregor Pupnic, încep și am încercat din când în când să fac aceste live-uri și în limba engleză, deoarece e important ca pe pagina mea de Facebook să vorbească cât se poate de mult experții. Din nefericire sau din diferite motive, anumite subiecte care implică expertiză, nu am contactele de care aș avea nevoie în România și de aceea solicit cunoștințe, prieteni sau indirect profesori universitari, experți în domeniu din Statele Unite sau Europa, care să poarte aceste discuții cu mine pe pagina mea de Facebook. Nu fac aceste dezbateri sau discuții în limba engleză din motivul de a arăta, de a avea aparența unui snob. Cum spun, o fac din dorința de a vă informa cât mai bine. Deci vreau să vă spun cum se va desfășura programul din seara aceasta. Voi face o introducere a oaspetelui meu, după aceea o să-i dau oaspetelui meu posibilitatea de a se prezenta pe sine însuși și după aceea vom intra în subiectele care le-am pregătit pentru seara aceasta. Voi explica în limba română fiecare întrebare pe care eu o voi pune domnului profesor, voi repeta întrebarea respectivă în limba engleză, voi îngădui interlocutorului meu să prezinte, să dea un răspuns întrebării sau temei respective, iar în final voi face un mic rezumat al prezentării dânsului pentru cei care nu cunosc sau nu înțeleg prea bine limba engleză. Deci, haideți să mergem înainte. Cum spuneam, domnul profesor Mark Regnerus este profesor de sociologie la University of Texas, Universitatea Texas din orașul Austin. Cum spuneam, este unul dintre cei mai influenți sociologi la ora actuală la nivel de Statele Unite, dar și la nivel mondial. Dânsul predă sociologia la una dintre cele mai influente și mai prestigioase universități din lume și aș putea spune a doua universitate ca prestigiu și influență din Statele Unite. Așa că, într-adevăr, suntem onorați să-l avem pe domnul Regnerus cu noi în seara aceasta. Dânsul este creștin și la vremea potrivită o să discutăm cu dânsul și acest aspect al vieții dânsului. Este catolic, e căsătorit de 25 de ani, e soț și tată a 2 copii. Deci e autor a multor cărți, studii și așa mai departe. Deci voi intra acum, voi începe discuția în limba engleză, iar după aceea vom intra din nou în limba română. Dr. Regnerus, I apologize. I have done a fairly lengthy introduction. I plan on spending about 5-6 minutes at the most. But lo and behold, I spent about 10 minutes doing an introduction of the subject and of yourself, my guest. I would like to say, Dr. Regnerus, that I am extremely happy that you have agreed to be on my Facebook page. Sure. I cannot tell you just how humbled I feel to have you with us tonight. I am a Christian myself, just like you are, and I'm trying to educate the people in Romania who follow me on my Facebook page concerning many subjects of real importance and consequence, and obviously family and marriage is one of them. I told the people that follow us on Facebook that I don't have a degree in sociology, and so we need the touch of the expert, so to speak. And so I explained to them a few things about yourself, and now I'd like for you to tell us, take all the time that you need and tell us a few things about yourself, your family,
sure,
and what you do, and we'll get into the subject that we have selected for tonight.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. It's been good to be here and good to renew our contact. I've been a professor of sociology at University of Texas in Austin here for 19 years. Briefly before that at Calvin College, named after John Calvin, the reformer, in Michigan. But I was born in Iowa the last day of 1970. I've been married for 28 years. I have 3 children, 22-year-old, 20-year-old, and a 12-year-old. And let's see, that's kind of the most important stuff. I'm a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for a PhD back in the year 2000. And I was originally a sociologist of religion, and I'll get into what sociology is in a second. But I started with a focus on religion and the religious influences on human behavior. And I kind of migrated over time into the study of relationship behavior. First on religious influences on relationship behavior, and then kind of a more devoted focus to the study of sexuality, and family relations, including marriage. The last book, which I think we'll talk about at some point, is called The Future of Christian Marriage. which is where I kind of come full circle from the sociology of religion, apply it back to the study of marriage. And that's a study of 7 different countries. Unfortunately, Romania was not among them. 7 out of the world's countries you have to pick. So let's see. So I should. Peter asked me to talk a little bit about first what sociology is, and it's good. I mean, I ought to be able to say something about that because I've taught intro. I taught it many years until the department kind of said, we would like to hand this course off to somebody else. And the handwriting on the wall was, I wasn't speaking enough about sort of the kind of big picture social problem questions that the United States is dealing with. So I gave that up, and now I teach research methods, which is sort of like how do you collect data as a sociologist. But sociology, back when I used to talk about it in class, is it a science? Is it not a science? We use the scientific method, but it's not a strict science in the kind of classic sense. But it aims at what Max Weber, the social theorist, called interpretative understanding of social behavior, for the purpose of explaining its causes, its course, and its effects. What prompts particular social behaviors to happen? How do they manifest themselves? What the course of that is, and to what effect? What happens as a result? So, sociology is unique when compared to psychology because it focuses on the social contexts that people live in, and kind of the social forces that impinge upon them, affect them, and to which they themselves contribute. Now, Max Weber also said it was interpretative because social life is it's not obvious. We have to do work to figure out what's going on. I mean, if it was obvious, then the entire population would see particular social problems, they'd agree upon them, they'd say, wow, this is what we need to do next. But that's, of course, not how it works. I mean, social life involves interpretation, and this is where you'll see lots of people disagree, or they'll agree about some things but not about others. But it's really sort of like you start to see something happen. So if I think about the demography, the falling marriage rates around the world, and like how to understand that is just not obvious. You could say, oh, it's this, people don't, men's employment statuses are in jeopardy. That's the reason. Well, that may be one reason, one piece of the puzzle, but we have to do interpretive work to kind of understand what's going on, right? So that's how sociology is kind of called, an interpretative venture using the scientific method. So that's a pretty good kind of general overview of what sociology is. So Peter, back to you.
All right. Well, I thank you very much. Let me explain. I'm going to switch to Romania now and make a summary of what you just explained to us in English so eloquently. Deci, domnul profesor ne-a spus câteva cuvinte despre dânsul. Dânsul e căsătorit de 28 de ani, spuneam la început de 25 de ani, 28 de ani. Spuneam că are 2 copii, are 3 copii. A predat la Universitatea din Texas, University of Texas, vreme de 19 ani. Înainte de asta a predat la o altă universitate, mi se pare, a spus vreme de 3 ani. S-a născut în decembrie 31, 1970 și îl pasionează sociologia. Vreme de mai mulți ani a predat sociologia religiei și anume a căutat să observe și să vadă modul în care religia influențează viața și comportamentul oamenilor. În timp a dezvoltat un interes, a devenit interesat în alte subiecte privind sociologia, inclusiv sexualitatea, revoluția sexuală, căsătoria, și chiar ne-a arătat pe ecran, ne-a arătat cartea pe care dânsul a publicat-o, ultima carte a dânsului, o carte pe care și eu am deja menționat-o pe pagina mea de Facebook de mai multe ori și am arătat-o, The Future of Christian Marriage, adică viitorul familiei creștine. Ne spunea că în această carte s-a focalizat pe date statistice obținute din 7 țări și spunea că din nefericire România nu este inclusă în acest studiu. Natural, când faci un studiu global trebuie să-ți găsești anumite țări, dar vom discuta și despre România pentru că România este menționată în cartea dânsului. Și de asemenea a dat răspuns la prima întrebare care am avut-o pentru el. L-am rugat să ne spună ce este sociologia pentru a înțelege cu toții și dânsul a spus ceea ce spuneam și eu mai devreme. Sociologia studiază relațiile dintre oameni, forțele sociale care sunt, știu eu, uneori în conflict, alteori în armonie în societate și caută să formuleze reguli pentru comportamentul social în spațiul public și nu numai. Și deci acestea sunt interesele dânsului din punct de vedere intelectual și vom discuta subiectul familiei într-un moment. A doua întrebare care o să o pun domnului Regnerus este: acum câțiva ani am studiat, am citit o carte. Acum câțiva ani am studiat, am citit o carte publicată de mai mulți autori englezi și am fost chiar surprins să văd că la originea acestui câmp de cercetare, și anume sociologia, cel puțin pe zona britanică, în Marea Britanică, mulți erau creștini. În secolul al XIX, când a apărut acest domeniu de studiere a societății, foarte mulți din sociologii care începuseră aceste studii în Marea Britanie erau creștini. Și am găsit potrivit să-i pun o întrebare domnului Regnerus să ne spună câteva cuvinte despre impactul creștinismului asupra dezvoltării acestui câmp de cercetare. Deci, din nou, mă întorc la limba engleză și voi pune această întrebare domnului Regnerus. Professor Regnerus, I just explained to the people in Romania that follow us on Facebook. I told them that the next question I would ask you would be about the impact of Christian sociologists. I have read a couple of years ago, I think it was maybe 10 years ago, a book was published, maybe read it, maybe not, but I read that book with great interest. A book was published, I think, in the UK by, concerning the origins of sociology, modern sociology. And I was really struck to see that the founders of British sociology, a fairly large number of them were actually practicing Christians. And I thought about asking you, because you are the expert. Mm-hmm. We are Christians, so we take pride in our Christianity and our Christian teachings and tradition. What has Christianity done? Has Christianity left an imprint, a footprint, I should say, on sociology and its development?
That's a good question. The origins of sociology are mixed. I'd say some of the founders were not Christians. And I think of 𝐂𝐻𝐈𝐕𝐄, one of the early sociologists, who really sort of saw institutional religion of generally monotheism as kind of a stage in sort of in terms of knowledge generation, a stage through which human society would invariably eventually pass. So it was kind of like one of the, not only the founders of sociology, but the idea of secularization. I mean, secularization theory has been pretty powerful for a very long time in sociology. So I would say the early origins of it were not. However, since the early origins of sociology were also concerned with the influences of especially the Industrial Revolution on human life and human institutions and on people and migration, poverty, things like that, the overlap between those early interests and Christians being involved with it obviously fit well. So I do know that in the United States and perhaps back in England, many of the early sociologists were Christian or expressed some form of Christian belief. Was it a motivator? Perhaps, but I mean, it was definitely sort of, I think of Walter Rauschenbusch and the social gospel movement in the United States in the late 1800s, very much motivated both by faith and by sort of the tools of social analysis. Some people would say, oh, it bordered on Marxist intentions at that time. I don't know that that's true for people like Rauschenbusch, although certainly they would have been a little bit more aggressively, or I should say less aggressively capitalist in that era than some would be today. So I'd say, yeah, the early teachers of sociology may well have been Christians, and some of them were. The seeds for it, I think, were not necessarily Christian in origin. And that goes away probably by the 1920s and 1930s, where you start to see much less of a Christian tinge to sociology. And that largely goes away, by and large, by the present day. It is not a discipline that is noted for its sort of distinctive Christian faith of its practitioners. And secularization theory is largely taken for granted, even while much of the world doesn't exhibit that same kind of secularization.
Yeah, thank you. I do recall that I have read in the book that I was referencing a while ago. Somebody had taken a Christian sociologist in the UK in the 19th century has really taken an interest in the Book of Numbers. Why the Book of Numbers? Why is the Book of Numbers in the Bible?
Like a census.
From a sociological point of view, was it the family? Was it descendants? Was it the family relationships? I don't know. That really has struck me as being something really unusual, something out of the ordinary. And so that's why I was asking this question. I'm going to switch to Romania now and explain briefly what you have just explained, and then I'll come back to the next question. Deci l-am întrebat pe domnul profesor dacă la originea sociologiei putem spune că au existat influențe creștine. Dânsul spune, dacă ne uităm la persoana care e creditată ca inițiind acest câmp de studii, de cercetare, sociologul francez 𝐂𝐻𝐈𝐕𝐄, putem spune că nu, dar dincolo, în Marea Britanie, într-adevăr, la începutul epocii industrializării, într-adevăr, sociologii din vremea aceea erau în marea lor majoritate creștini, erau natural interesați să vadă de modul în care dezvoltarea industrială și fenomenul industrializării avea un impact asupra creștinismului, asupra relațiilor dintre oameni și așa mai departe. Dânsul ne-a făcut o mică prezentare privind evoluția influenței creștinismului asupra sociologiei până în anii 20-30 ai veacului trecut și ne spune că, din nefericire, în ultimii 100 de ani, influența creștinismului asupra câmpului de studiu sociologiei a scăzut foarte mult și dânsul chiar spunea că la ora actuală putem spune că în sociologie practic nu mai există nicio influență creștină. Deci mulțumim pentru acest aspect istoric. O să mă întorc iarăși în limba engleză să pun următoarea întrebare domnului profesor. Vreau să vă spun în limba română care e al treilea subiect care l-am decis pentru seara aceasta. Și anume, e vorba de căsătoriile între persoane de același sex. Și cum spuneam, o să discutăm subiectul care cred că va fi principala tema discuției din seara aceasta, impactul acestui nou fenomen social asupra copiilor. Deci, iară schimb, trec dincolo în limba engleză. So, Dr. Regnerus, I just explained to the public that we are going to talk about the next subject, and that's going to be the impact of same-sex marriage on children. if there ever was an expert, if there is somebody that actually follow with a great deal of interest in this area, it is you. I don't really read a lot of the studies published by, quote, the other side, because I don't really fully understand the sociology and the terminology. But you have this gift of being able to explain in plain terms various studies that come up and so on and so forth. And I know that you yourself have created a tremendous study concerning the impact of same-sex marriage on children. It's a fairly new phenomenon, and I know that Holland in the Netherlands, I think April the 1st or February the 1st, I forgot the exact date, celebrated, quotation marks, celebrated 20 years of same-sex marriage as a brand new institution in the history of mankind in Holland. Then Canada followed, and then other countries, including the United States, in 2015, and so on and so forth. So I think that in this debate, we have sort of forgotten the children. When this debate was taking place, going on about the pros and the cons concerning same-sex marriage. But again, it seems that we have forgotten the kids. So I would like for you to take all the time that you need. I will take copious notes. And if I need to, I will slow it down if need be, because I want to make sure that people understand the impact of same-sex marriage, this brand new institution, if you will, man-made, on kids, on children.
Yeah. Let's break it up then. I'll talk a bit, and then you can pose a question back to me, and that would work best, because one could go on this subject for a very long time. So I got into the study of, I was going to say same-sex parenting on children, but that's not what my study actually was. It was the adult children between ages 18 to 39 reflecting upon their parents, one of whom, typically one, occasionally both, had been in a same-sex relationship at some point while they were growing up, while the child was growing up. That was published in 2012, and my life has never been the same since. It's fair to say, because of the controversy that sort of stirred up, because it was it was disputing a consensus view, which the idea that there's a consensus so prematurely and early is always a mystery to me as a sociologist. I mean, whenever you see sort of scientists coalesce quickly around a particular item, should give people a bit of pause, not to be combative for its own sake, but just to sort of make sure that we're seeing the same thing. This is where the interpretive understanding of aspect of sociology comes into play. So the study that I produced revealed that the children who had a mother or a father, typically a mother, twice as often as a father, who had been in a same-sex relationship, did not fare nearly so well as kids who grew up in a stably married mother and father household. Now, after all the dust settled from that controversy, the bottom line really in the science of this stuff is about a couple different things. One is, who are we talking about when we're talking about same-sex couples with children? And what are the dynamics that are characteristic of households, same-sex parent households? And what are the kinds of ways in which we might expect children to experience that? Okay, so the first of those things is really tricky, because I was criticized back in that day, 10 years ago, for not finding very many adult children who had grown up their entire life in what we would consider a same-sex couple household. So, And I said to people, and I wrote it in the original study, well, this is just reality back in that era. But that reality kind of contested this vision of that you see in media portrayals, happy, typically white, female couple with children, right? And that's just and then there's this presumption of stability that, oh, they created these children somehow, probably artificial reproductive technology, perhaps. There's just one guesses by looking at those photos. And then there's a presumption of this stable, loving relationship between the two parents and each other and the children for their entire growing up years. And that was really a fiction for a very long time. It is more true today. The question is just how much more true. And frankly, that remains an open empirical question that I'm interested in. Because so a lot of this comes down to sort of, are same-sex couple households as stable as married mothers and fathers? And if not, why not? Well, one of the things that is perpetually lacking is the two biological connections to the child. In the history of studying step-parenting and step-fathering in particular, it is always considered a risk for a child to grow up in the house of a male adult to whom they were not related genetically. That was, that still is considered, a bit of a risk for both violence of a physical and sexual nature, and just the sort of, perhaps diminished sense of care for the child that is not biologically his. Historically, this is why we have often guarded households fairly tightly, because we wanted to be sure of both, of paternity. One is always certain of maternity, but not of paternity. So then for this study to sort of say, hey, there's some issues when people did not, when they grew up with a mother, typically a mother who had been in a same-sex relationship, the question becomes like, okay, why are they, how has this child come to be in this relationship? Historically, and I would hazard a guess, but it's an educated guess, still today, that the primary vehicle is still a broken heterosexual union, even among lesbian couples today. Not entirely, of course, but so there's questions about diminished kinship and how much that matters. And I think the science, insofar as I understand it, and one of my colleagues, Paul Sullins, has written about this, probably with a better study than I did, I think, that diminished kinship matters and tends to harm children in various ways. Now, when we think about like the effects on children, there's lots of ways in which children can feel effects of things from their parents and from their surroundings. Sometimes we're talking about direct effects, to speak in a social science kind of sense. Sometimes we're talking about an indirect sense. Okay, so one example of probably a positive effect of same-sex parenting that I've come to realize over time is, especially with regard to men, two men who have a child together, typically by surrogacy or adoption, at least in the United States, tend to be notably wealthier than either two women or married mother and father, because on average, two men are less interested in having a child, and so the bar for them to be interested in is much higher, and so it tends to be more pro-social, wealthy dads who pursue having a child. And we all know that having financial resources is good for children. So it's no surprise to see an indirect effect of having basically fairly wealthy, on average, gay dads on children's educational outcomes, right? If a child has educational difficulties, it's always helpful to have money laying around that you can spend on tutoring and tuition and things like that. So the debate about this stuff has always been kind of simplistic and not recognizing the details. At the same time, the debate in terms of its public aspects has always kind of tracked in the direction of outliers, right? You'll see a very articulate spokesperson, either a gay parent or a child of two lesbians or something like that. And sort of the narrative pulls on your heartstrings, like, oh, my parents sacrificed for me, loved me, etc. And then you get the impression that this must be the average experience. Now, so back in 2012, when I published this study, I was very interested in doing a nationally representative sample, because this would have been only the second one. And the first one that had been done before me had very few outcome variables of interest that, so they studied progress in school. Like, did you move from 3rd to 4th or 4th to 5th grade in a predictably timely fashion? Like, well, that's one educational variable out of many educational variables compared to all the other kinds of things we might want to know about. So I said I was going to ask about a lot of different kinds of outcomes, both their reflections on their growing up years and also their situation today, the kids who had a same-sex parent. And so I found, much different kind of scenarios. Now, people pushed back saying, well, things are different today, Mark, right? And I'm basically saying, hey, and the data that I have of young adults, because part of me, I didn't want to ask children this stuff because children are very impressionable. They buy into what their parents do and think and say. Like, I wanted a little bit of critical distance, so I interviewed young adults about their experience. So it's messy, right? The household dynamics are messy. The amount of time most of these children spent in households with two parents of the same sex was limited. We saw a fair amount of relationships in which the mother had relationships with other men as well as women. And it's a reflection in some ways of reality, right? One of the greatest gifts I think sociology can give the world, if we stick to that project, is a thick description of the way things are as best we can discern them. So in reality, things are always going to be different than the kind of simplistic media informed or mediated vision of what same-sex parents and households are like. As the same thing is the case for married mothers and fathers. They're fairly complex households too at times. That's partly why I didn't ask any questions about, how happy were your parents in their marriage? Because most of the focus now is not on whether parents are married, but like how happily they're married. I don't know if I'm old school or what, but I happen to think that, marital happiness is not as important as marital stability. And stability can foster happiness with two willing spouses, but it's no guarantee, but it's still a good environment for a child. So I've been talking for a long time, Peter. Perhaps I should take a break and you can follow up with a particular question if you have one.
Absolutely. You have certainly stimulated my thinking here. I do have a couple of more questions related to this same subject. I think that the public would be interested to know what your findings were. You stated that children that have, these people, this segment of the population that we are talking about, between 18 and 39, and their experiences, and you explained that your finding was that they did not do as well as children that were raised in intact families, with mom and dad. And that's one question I want to ask you about your specific findings. There are studies out there that I have seen concerning the impact when you put side by side children raised in the natural family, as I call it, natural marriage, and the modern version, same-sex marriage, so on and so forth. There are major differences with respect to the inclination towards irresponsible behavior, alcohol, drug consumption, violence, not doing that well in school. So if you could touch on that subject in a couple of minutes. And then I don't know if you have a notepad next to you or not, but another subject I want to talk with you about is the politicization of these studies, because I have seen myself that a lot of these studies that attempt to counter what your perception and your findings are might come from a small number of I think you call them not cohort studies, the group that you actually study, I forgot the exact name for it, from Australia, where everybody is happy and so on and so forth. So I want to ask you about the political aspect of some of these studies. And I also want to talk with you about, you're talking about the kids and how impressionable they are. Nowadays, we see that there is a push, especially in the month of May, to take kids to the Pride events. Colors, everybody's young, everybody's happy, the impact on the kids. But before we get to these subjects, let me switch back to Romanian and explain to the people that follow us and tell them what you have said. In the meanwhile, I see that you have very nice compliments from some of the people that I don't know if you can see the comments or not. Gabriel is saying from Romania, thank you for explaining very important things to us. At a high level, they must be understood, and so on and so forth. Children are very important to everyone. They are very delicate, and therefore this area should be walked with caution. So we appreciate your comments, folks. If you have specific questions for Dr. Regnerus, let us put them on the screen, type them in, and we'll ask them. Let me go ahead and switch to Romanian, then I'll come back to English. Deci caut să fac un mic sumar a prezentării domnului Regnerus de până acum. Ne spunea că în anul 2012 dânsul a publicat un studiu, mi se pare spunea al doilea studiu de acest gen făcut în Statele Unite, privind copiii care au crescut în familii unde mama trăia cu o altă femeie, tatăl cu un bărbat. Și s-a focalizat pe un grup de vârstă între 18 și 39 de ani și a pus o mulțime de întrebări acestor persoane privind modul în care ei au crescut când erau minori copii, fără mamă sau fără tată în familie sau, din nou, într-un cămin format doar din cupluri de același sex. Dânsul spunea, și eu l-am rugat să ne explice mai pe îndelete, dânsul spunea că studiile pe care dânsul le-a făcut denotă faptul că acești copii, când ajung maturi, când ajung adulți, nu pot naviga, nu se ajustează așa de bine societății, nu au un nivel destul de sănătos din punct de vedere al educației, al comportamentului social și așa mai departe. L-am întrebat de asemenea să ne explice fenomenul de politizare a acestor studii care se petrece sub ochii noștri. Media spune că toată lumea arată frumos, toată lumea e fericită și spunea și dânsul, cum spun și eu de multe ori, tot ceea ce noi vedem în presă, fie presa europeană, fie presa română, sunt oameni care arată frumos, care se țin de mână, culorile sunt stridente, toată lumea e fericită, toată lumea se înțelege perfect ca și când ar fi raiul pe pământ, și dânsul spunea că nu este chiar așa. Vreau să menționez un termen pe care dânsul l-a folosit în limba engleză și să-l explic în limba română, conceptul de diminished kinship, adică relațiile diminuate. Dânsul spunea că full kinship, adică relațiile pline de familie, sunt relațiile în care copiii sunt crescuți de o mamă și un tată în aceeași familie, în aceeași casă. Ceea ce vedem la cuplurile de același sex, spunea dânsul, este diminished kinship, adică situația în care acest fenomen al plinarității, dacă vrei, copilului, unde beneficiază de influența mamei și a tatălui în mod simultan, nu există în copii care sunt crescuți doar de persoane de același sex și ca atare acest fenomen aduce daune asupra comportamentului și stării emoționale a copiilor, mai ales la copiii care sunt crescuți doar de femei. L-am rugat de asemenea să ne spună câteva cuvinte despre acest nou fenomen și moda asta care apare tot mai proeminentă pe orizont și o vedem și în zilele acestea la televizor. Copiii minori sunt duși la aceste evenimente ale marșurilor diversității așa numite și l-am rugat să ne spună câteva cuvinte despre lucrul acesta. Dr. Regnerus, if you'll give me one moment, I do want to recommend to our people in Romania 2 books, and you're welcome to comment on these books because I'm going to mention them in English as well. The first one is, and you'll have to help me out with this, I did read Mr. Lopez's book called 𝐿𝐻𝐄𝐓𝐄𝐑. Daughters. Do you remember that book?
Yeah.
What is Dr. Lopez's first name?
Robert Oscar.
Yeah, I confuse him with David. It's Oscar. You're right. Oscar Lopez. I'm going to tell folks in Romania about this book. They can look it up online and maybe read the book or some book reviews. Spuneam domnului profesor, vreau să vă recomand o carte publicată de o persoană, profesor universitar cu numele de Oscar Lopez. A publicat o carte în limba engleză care se numește 𝐿𝐻𝐄𝐓𝐄𝐑, Daughter, fiicele lui Jefta. Acum vreo 4, 5, 6 ani a apărut această carte și am făcut o recenzie a cărții pe pagina, prin Alianța Familiilor din România și îmi fac aici o notiță. Dacă nu uit, o să vă trimit linkul pe pagina mea de Facebook. Veți putea citi recenzia acelei cărți care am făcut-o eu și o puteți să citiți și distribui altora. De asemenea, going back to you, Dr. Regnerus, I want to tell them about Dr. Dobson's 2 books, which I have read, which I would recommend, which I'm going to recommend to the people in Romania as well. Dr. Dobson has written books about how to bring up kids. I think he published a book called Bringing Up Boys, and then he published a separate book called Bringing Up Girls. So if you'll give me 1 minute to explain, to encourage them to read these books, and then I will switch back and you can please discuss those 3 topics that I have mentioned. Dragilor, vreau să menționez de asemenea că un alt, mi se pare psiholog, nu sociolog, doctorul Dobson de la Family, am uitat cum îi spune organizației, Family ceva din Colorado, a scris 2 cărți, Bringing Up Boys, cum să crești băieții, iar a doua carte este Bringing Up Girls, cum să crești fetele. Din nou am citit cărțile acestea, am făcut recenzii în limba română și le puteți găsi online. Vi le recomand celor care vreți să cunoașteți diferența între a crește copii într-o familie intactă, naturală, creștină și a crește copii într-o atmosferă secularistă, în mod specific părinți de același sex. Dr. Regnerus, let's go back and if you will please go ahead and address those 3 subtopics that I mentioned a short while ago.
Do me a favor and repeat them so they're fresh in mind.
Yes, sir. The first one was, you were saying that you have done your study in 2012, and one of your findings was that the children that who grew up in same-sex households did not do as well as children raised in the traditional household relationship. So that would be one subject I think the public would be interested to know.
Sure.
The other one would be that Australian study which done on children and same-sex households where everybody, according to the study, was happy.
Yeah, I think so.
The point for me was how are these studies politicized, and the last one, the last subject was taking kids to the Pride nowadays.
Right. I'll be better at the first two than the last one, since those are more in my domain of study.
Sure.
So the new family structure study, which is what I did, and what, people have lots of opinions about it over the years. It's still tweeted about. And frankly, the article was not retracted. There's no reason to retract it. It was criticized, but not, there's nothing fundamentally flawed about it, even though people will claim that it is true. The criticisms come in the form of these kinds of things I just talked about, and a couple things I'll mention in a second. But so what did it actually say? So when we compare children who grew up in an intact biological family, mom and dad married, and they were there the entire childhood, when you compare those to kids who said they had a mother who had been in a same-sex relationship, now again, that may not have lasted that long. Some of them did, some of them didn't. But when you compare those two, the latter have a more difficult time, and they also reflect more differently on their childhood than kids in a stable household. So currently, children for whom that was the case are more likely to cohabit, not to marry. Their mother had been in a same-sex relationship. They're more likely to have reported receiving welfare or community assistance while they were growing up. They're less likely to be employed today, more likely to be unemployed today. And here's one that's sort of, an obvious one now, but people resisted this claim for the longest time, that they would be more so. Children who grew up in the same-sex household, or a mother or father had a same-sex relationship, are indeed notably more likely to identify as something besides heterosexual, whether it be bisexual or lesbian or gay, etc. So they're more likely to have experienced some form of sexual violence, the sources of which are impossible from this data to understand or to discern. But it indicates a sort of a vulnerability. Now, they're not alone in this vulnerability. People who were adopted, people whose parents divorced later in their teenage years, also prone to some of this kind of vulnerability. But when you compare it back to what I call the gold standard, right, a married mom and dad, I mean, it's just notable that the kind of gold standard is protective in a variety of ways. In fact, we looked at 40 different outcomes, both in the present time and then from the past, and 25 of the 40, there were statistically significant differences between the kids from the intact biological family and the family where the mother had a same-sex relationship. Fewer differences where the father had a same-sex relationship, but some of that has to do with the sample size. So just a sort of a little crash course in statistics, the more people you talk to, the more sensitive it is to sort of to differences that you can detect between groups. So in fact, I'm going to segue just a little bit to Peter's question about that Australian study. If it's the one I'm thinking of, the 𝐂𝐎𝐒, it was a non-representative study. Mine was a random sample. And so when you have a representative study, people can opt in. Oh, I want to participate in your study, right? Well, the kinds of people who want to participate in your study are fundamentally different than the kinds of people who are contacted randomly. So anytime you see a difference in this, you're going to notice, probably, especially in this case, fewer statistical differences between married mom and dad households and same-sex households on these kinds of outcomes. But, the reason I got into this was because all we were being treated to as social scientists were these sort of small sample, non-representative studies. In fact, there's one called the National Longitudinal Lesbian Family Study, it is longitudinal. It does track people over time. It's not national. That's kind of a, that's in there for sort of a propaganda purpose. It was collected in 3 different cities, and they were recruited from women who had frequented sort of lesbian bookstores. So they would have been more political in orientation, etc. And also sort of more educated, more white, all that stuff. And they've published, that group has published at least 25 or 26 studies over 17 or 18 years. No, more than that. Such that, I've published 1 or 2, right? A follow-up to my study. They've published 26. So it's like, you see the deck stacked against you, even though the kind of data they analyzed from the beginning was much smaller. There was less than 100 cases, basically hand-selected by the people who are participating in them. And then they follow their children as they grow up. So eventually they stop talking to the parents, who of course probably have some vested interest in describing their children in a positive light. Then they start talking to the children, who over the years have obviously caught on to the study. It's like they don't want their mothers and her partners to be harmed, so they're going to sort of kind of sanitize their version of reality, or at least I shouldn't say they will do that. The temptation is strong to do that. It's impossible to detect whether that's true or not in their case. But, there's a reason social scientists privilege random nationally representative studies, because it gives you a greater portrait of the average. And I've always been interested in like the average experience out there. And certainly when you come to something that's such a politicized as this, we want to know the average experience, because one can always haul out the best experiences and the worst experiences for demonstration. And that's true of any kind of household. But, I would rather get the overall picture, the average picture. So I know that that's the case typically with the Australian study that I'm aware of. It is not nationally representative. A variety of American studies have not been nationally representative. Some European studies have been. And so anytime that happens, I'm much more interested in knowing sort of what the situation is. And one of the things I mentioned earlier, which has replicated itself in some Dutch data just released last year, is that even in the Netherlands, probably arguably the most tolerant, progressive country in the world, you still see this proclivity towards more instability in same-sex relationships. It doesn't seem to affect children as much, I think, because there's a social class and moneyed aspect to it, especially when you're evaluating outcomes like education, which was the focus of that Dutch study. But I noted, because it's always been an interest of mine, about the stability of relationships. Because, I talk about divorce and family breakup as the gift that keeps on taking. I use that in the Future of Christian Marriage, because it's like when parents split, that's something that children have to navigate and deal with for years, across generations. And so I was very interested in that Dutch data, and sure enough, it documented that there's a bit of a statistically different experience of stability in those kinds of relationships, because I had speculated back in 2012, after all the criticisms of my study came out, I went back to the data and answered a variety of the questions that people were interested in talking about. Didn't make any difference. They had already made up their mind about that they didn't like the study. But, I look at what is the situations in which children are born, and how much is instability a variable that's it's part of the experience of same-sex households rather than an aberrant or unusual experience. So, and I came to the conclusion there, and I have not seen any data since to suggest that that such households are as stable as opposite-sex married households. Now, but to segue a little bit, the emphasis today has switched in some ways from this emphasis on like there are no differences between same-sex and opposite-sex experiences to kind of what you might call the queering of family life, right? Queering meaning kind of taking apart the heteronormativity, right? Understanding that there's one right way or one better way to do families. And so, kind of they get you coming or going. So you'll find trouble if you're trying to document differences or open to differences between such households. But even if there are differences, the kind of more modern critique of that is, well, families come in all different sizes. None of them are better than any other, which, most social scientists, if they're honest with themselves, would still recognize that, yeah, there are some family structures that are healthier for children. And not just in terms of like, will you pass your classes? Will you go to college? But, the interpersonal relationships between mother, child, their experience of schooling, their psychological health, depression, anxiety, lots of these different kinds of things. So the politicization that has been characteristic of the science here hasn't gone away. It's not going to go away. And I said it more recently that it's not about sort of the detection of simplistic differences. It's about how do social scientists analyze data? Because there's a saying, torture the data long enough and it will confess to whatever you want, right? And there are ways in building statistical models that I hold inappropriate ways to build statistical models that you can sort of bleed statistical significance from any variable and come to the conclusion that you want. So this is the question about household instability that people and I squabble about is it a control variable? Something that you want to sort of say, well, this happens to some people. Let's account for it and still keep our focus on whether same-sex or opposite-sex households are different. And my approach to this is, well, this seems to be a pathway by which a fair amount of distinctions between children in such households operates, right? That if there is endemic instability, or by endemic meaning not necessarily pervasive, but sort of a pronounced difference between same-sex and opposite-sex households, then I think it's not appropriate to use it as a control variable, but to say this is a pathway by which same-sex households affect children by the likelihood, the greater likelihood that they will break up. I'll stop there.
Let me go ahead and do a summary of what you have presented so far in response to my last two questions. And then once we are done, once I'm done doing that, I realized that we could spend much more time on the impact of same-sex marriage on kids. We have two.
We probably should move along.
Yeah, we have 2 or 3 more subjects that I would like to cover with you tonight, including this excellent book that you have published, The Future of Christian Marriage.
Yeah.
And let's go ahead and let me go ahead and do a brief summary of what you have said in the last 10 or 15 minutes. Deci l-am întrebat pe domnul profesor să ne expună în mod clar, în mod direct, care sunt ce a descoperit dânsul, ce a aflat dânsul în acest studiu din 2012 privind diferența între copiii crescuți în familiile tradiționale și copiii crescuți în familiile netradiționale, în sensul de familii constituite din doi bărbați sau două femei. Dânsul spunea că și-a focalizat investigația pe aproximativ 40 de aspecte ale vieții umane: educația, sănătatea emoțională, comportamentul nociv sau normalitatea comportamentului și așa mai departe. Și dânsul spunea că în 24 din cele 40 de câmpuri de studiu sau focalizare pe care dânsul le-a studiat, în 24 de categorii, dacă vreți, diferențele între copiii crescuți în familiile tradiționale și cei crescuți în familii netradiționale sunt enorme, sunt chiar proeminente și eu le menționez. Dânsul nu ne-a dat date statistice, poate e bine că nu ne-a dat pentru că ne-a fi pierdut în atât de multe detalii, dar vreau să mi-am făcut o listă ca să vedeți în ce domenii fundamentale copiii crescuți de dumneavoastră în familii tradiționale sunt mult mai sănătoși și au un comportament mult mai bun decât copiii care sunt crescuți în cămine constituite din doi bărbați sau două femei. În primul rând, spunea dânsul, privind sănătatea emoțională, copiii care sunt crescuți în familii tradiționale sunt mult mai sănătoși din punct de vedere emoțional, au abilitatea de a confrunta vicisitudinile vieții mult mai bine decât copiii care sunt crescuți de cupluri de același sex. Acești minori, acești copii, când devin adulți, au o capacitate diminuată de a confrunta dificultățile vieții și de a își menține un echilibru emoțional de care au nevoie pentru a confrunta și a duce viața mai înainte. De asemenea, afirma despre instabilitatea în relații. Atunci când acești copii devin adulți, dânsul spunea, relațiile pe care le formează sunt relații de scurtă durată. Adică sar în relație, unii dintre ei trăiesc câtva timp cu o persoană de același sex, după aceea își schimbă viața și trăiesc cu persoane de sex opus, după aceea revin la un alt stil de viață. Deci viața lor este fragmentată, deloc stabilă, scuzați-mă. De asemenea, dânsul afirma că instabilitatea relațiilor cuplurilor de același sex este cuplurile de același sex dovedesc o instabilitate relațională mult mai ridicată decât cuplurile heterosexuale. De asemenea, dânsul spunea că odată ajunși adulți, copiii crescuți în cămine formate din părinți de același sex tind să fie mai trândavi, mai leneși. Foarte mulți dintre ei sunt șomeri, nu sunt interesați în a munci. Incidența șomajului e mult mai ridicată la acești copii decât la copiii crescuți, adulți, decât copiii care s-au format și și-au format personalitatea în cămine formate din doi părinți de sex opus. De asemenea, spunea că dependența de alcool, dependența de tutun, dependența de droguri este mult mai ridicată la copiii care sunt crescuți în căminele formate din cupluri de același sex decât căminele formate din cupluri de sex opus, mamă și tată. De asemenea, dânsul spunea că din nefericire copiii care sunt crescuți în cămine formate din doi părinți de același sex au o incidență sau o inclinație mult mai ridicată când devin adulți să se identifice din punct de vedere sexual cu ca fiind neheterosexuale. În alte cuvinte, de obicei, fetele care sunt crescute de două femei tind, atunci când devin mature, să practice sau să ducă un mod de viață asemenea mamelor lor, adică să întrețină relații cu persoane de același sex mai mult decât cu persoane de sex opus. De asemenea, vorbea despre violența sexuală. Violența sexuală este mult mai ridicată, spunea dânsul, în familiile sau în căminele formate din persoane de același sex ca părinți, decât în familiile formate dintr-un bărbat și o femeie. De asemenea, o să-i pun întrebarea aceasta din câte am citit eu. De asemenea, incidența inclinațiilor înspre transgenderism este mult mai ridicată la acești copii care cresc în aceste cămine formate din cupluri de același sex. Spunea dânsul de asemenea că evaluează multe studii de acest gen în Statele Unite și în Olanda. Spunea că aceste studii sunt politizate. Un exemplu pe care ni l-a dat este studiul pe care dânsul l-a făcut. A fost un studiu aleatoriu, adică nu și-a găsit persoane din diferite orașe ale Americii, 3 orașe diferite, pe când studiile făcute de grupurile pro-homosexuale sunt studii unde persoanele care doresc zic că vreau să particip la studiul acesta. Deci persoanele care se doresc să participe la aceste studii, dar nu sunt invitate să participe, sunt persoane care au o motivație politică pentru a participa la aceste studii. Ne spunea dânsul așa întreagă și vreau să menționez ce i s-a întâmplat. După ce a publicat acest studiu în anul 2012, s-a lansat în Statele Unite o acțiune online în public împotriva dânsului din partea celor care nu gândesc ca și noi și au solicitat Universității din Texas să îl dea afară de la lucru, să îl destituie din funcția de profesor de sociologie, dar dânsul a rămas tare pe metereze. I s-au instituit acțiuni la nivel de asociațiile sociologilor din Statele Unite pentru a-i lua titlul de sociolog și a nu mai permite să predea sociologia în Statele Unite, tocmai pentru că dânsul, fiind cinstit, onest din punct de vedere intelectual, a ales să ne spună adevărul privind ceea ce a descoperit prin studiul dânsului. Deci avem de a face cu un om extraordinar în seara aceasta. Avem onoarea să-l avem cu noi pe acest domn profesor care nu doar este onest din punct de vedere intelectual, dar a fost ținta, targetul mișcărilor opuse, care a căutat să discrediteze studiile dânsului și profesia dânsului și să îl destituie din funcția de profesor, dar nu au reușit. Okay, Professor Regnerus, I have made a brief presentation of what you have explained a short while ago. And now I would like for us to focus on this fascinating book, which is called The Future of Christian Marriage. It's probably taken you, I don't know, years to study and present this book. Let's see if you can do this over the next maybe 10-15 minutes and present the main points of your book to our public in Romania. And by the way, the book has not yet been translated into Romanian, correct? We cannot hear you.
Any other language. So I wrote that book and it got published in 2020, right during the heart of the pandemic, which is a bad time to publish books. That and the election in the United States just sort of killed any hope of good book sales at the time. So I'm trying to resurrect interest in it a little bit. And I'm finding a variety of interest out there. So the basic idea is I had finished a book before this, which we're not talking about, entitled Cheap Sex, The Transformation of Men, Marriage, and Monogamy. That came out in 2017. And so I wanted to, the conclusions from that book were somewhat depressing. Kind of like this was a study of basically the mating market in the United States. And so I thought, well, let's see if things are better among Christians, and let's also sort of see if things are better elsewhere around the world. So I said, okay, let's study Christians and let's interview them one-on-one, not a nationally representative thing. That's impossible for this. So let's do interviews in Mexico, the United States, Spain, Poland, Russia, Lebanon, and Nigeria. Kind of try to get a spectrum. I didn't get Asia. I was supposed to have India. Didn't happen. So what did I learn? That's what. So the book is about. Sort of, is the marital impulse among Christians, young adult Christians, waning? because we see it's waning in general. Although I will say, I think Romania is actually in that original. Yeah, I mean, Poland and Romania kind of demonstrate elevated levels of marriage rates for people under 30 compared to much of their European peers.
And I apologize. I think that's on page 12. I have read a couple of chapters from your book last night. I think that's on page 12. If you don't mind going to page 12, since you are speaking about Romania, I want to make sure that people in Romania will do understand that to some extent Romania is mentioned in your book.
Yeah.
And I think I apologize for interrupting, but when you mentioned Poland and Romania, it came to mind that on page 12 you do talk about Romania.
Mm-hmm. So what I have there is sort of the percent of women between the ages of 25 to 29 who have ever been married at different times, 1980, 1990, 2000, and then the latest. And also the average age at which people get married, or women between 25 and 29. So, and it revealed that in much of the West, we've seen just a complete drop-off in marriage rates from 1980, where it was like consistently high 70s to 80 to even 90% of women prior to age 30 had married. Now, why am I focused on women? Well, women have a bit more time concern around marriage as it's connected to fertility. And marrying by 30 has long been kind of a benchmark common experience in adulthood. So, but you can track from the 80s until the present, just sort of a plummeting, right? So, for example, in the Czech Republic, 91% of women in that 25 to 29 year age had been married back in 1980. And the last time we checked, 26%. So it went from 91 to 26%, which is it's dropping off the cliff, really. And as I said, Poland and Romania exhibited the smallest decline, although still a decline. So in Romania, they didn't have data for 1980, but 1990, 88.7% of women in that age range had been married. By 2000, 69%. So it's like it dropped quickly, and then it dropped to 59%. So you might say, well, that doesn't sound good. True, but it's 59% is better than most of the other countries that are in the 20s, 30s, or 40s. Poland being just a little bit above them at 61%.
Do you mind if I tell them in Romanian about this data? Because I think it's very fascinating. Una din observațiile dânsului în această carte este pe pagina 12 și dânsul a fost interesat să vadă modul în care sau în ce măsură femeile în diferite țări se căsătorește de la ce vârstă și dacă în ultimii 20-25 de ani asistăm la un declin al vârstei și interesului în căsătorie la femei, și o să ne explice în câteva minute de ce a ales să se focalizeze pe femei. Dânsul spune așa, ne dă 3 exemple. În Cehia, între 1980 și 1981, 91% din femeile între vârsta de 25 de ani și 29 de ani erau căsătorite. Deci un nivel chiar ridicat de căsătorie. La ora actuală, doar 26% din femeile din Cehia în această categorie de vârstă sunt căsătorite. Deci pe parcursul la 40 de ani sau cam așa ceva, vedem un declin de la 91% la aproape un sfert din populația Cehiei. Și acum România, pentru că dă date și privind România, conform datelor statistice privind România. În 1980 nu avem date privind România în 1980, dar avem date pentru perioada din 1990 și 1991 până în anul 2000. În anul 1990, 88,7% din femeile României între vârsta de 25 și 29 de ani erau căsătorite. Deci 88, aproape 89% din toate femeile din România între 25 de ani și 29 de ani erau căsătorite la vremea aceea, acum 30 de ani. În anul 2000, acest procent a scăzut la 69%. Deci în anul 2000, doar 69% din femeile României între 25 și 29 de ani erau căsătorite. Iar conform ultimelor date, doar 59% din femeile României între 25 și 29 de ani sunt căsătorite. Conform datelor date de domnul profesor, România este pe locul 2 în Europa privind vârsta aceasta. La un nivel mai ridicat este Polonia cu 61%, iar cel mai jos nivel este, conform acestor date, 21% în Danemarca, ceea ce înseamnă că la ora actuală doar 21% din femeile din Danemarca între 25 și 29 de ani sunt căsătorite. Deci mă întorc înapoi în limba engleză să spun domnului profesor să continue ceea ce a descoperit făcând aceste studii. Și Professor Regnerus, I want to also read another, and then please continue. I want to read another comment that is addressed to you. Gabriel says, we need to be in solidarity with these people who take the risk to tell us 5 times, 9 times an important truth for us, such as the future of our children. I offer to give all the necessary support and I urge others to do the same. This is in response to a comment I made in Romanian when I told our audience that you have really been the subject to terrible attacks in 2012 and subsequently on account of your steadfastness and the audacity to publish that study which went against the grain. So I apologize for interrupting. Go ahead and continue.
No, that's an encouraging thing to see.
Yeah, yep.
That's great.
Romania is behind you.
I appreciate it.
I am, and millions of Christians in Romania are behind you. They are delighted to have you.
I have a special place in my heart for all of Central and Eastern Europe on this stuff. I've done some work in Poland, and you see sort of the historical accomplishments of these countries, and you think they're holding on to some Western values that the rest of the West has sort of decided they no longer need, which is almost suicidal, because these are some of the important values that have made the West so attractive to people. And so, I can appreciate a comment like that.
You're very welcome. You're freezing up.
Age at marriage. Is that any better?
Yes. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Why is this age at marriage rising? Why is the share of marriage declining? And what does it indicate? And does it mean that somehow marriage has changed? And so one of the things that I talk about in the book is that I think there's a real shift going on in how people talk about marriage and what they think about it. Not necessarily how marriage actually works, but like what they're envisioning about it. So one of the things that has subtly changed, and I didn't invent this idea, this is another better sociologist of family than me, who talked about the idea that we've shifted from the notion of marriage as a foundation, kind of the anchor of the adult life course, to a capstone event, basically. We now see ourselves as preparing to marry rather than marrying in order to achieve particular goals. Now we think of marriage as somehow, well, we want it to safeguard and reinforce our independence, not to sort of foster an interdependence between us and our spouse. So, but if you think about this capstone and foundation business, it's a very important development. Think about like what a capstone is. It's like, it's the finishing touch of a structure, a moment in time So as people move through their 20s, right? It's unusual for people to marry now, but before age 20, and it's almost unusual to marry before age 30 now. So how do we think about our 20s? We think about them now as sort of the preparation for the rest of adulthood, but that we become marriageable. And that marriageability is something that we have to achieve. So rather than sort of, oh, marriage is the kind of normative foundational experience that is consonant with the early 20s to mid 20s, from which we build something. But when we think of marriage as a foundation, well, a foundation we know is hard-wearing. It's the thing that supports something. Whereas a capstone is like, well, you don't really need it. It's kind of nice, icing on the cake in some ways. So I argue in the book that this capstone mentality has now infused much of the West on marriage. And, where did it begin? It's a little bit difficult to say, but I'm quite positive that marital ideas have been exported very effectively from my side of the Atlantic to yours through media of various types, music, film, television, etc. And this shift in the meaning of marriage, not necessarily the experience of it, but the meaning of it, has turned, at least in the States here, marriage into what amounts to an unaffordable luxury good. And I think sort of marriage has become kind of a social justice issue because everybody across the social classes and socioeconomic statuses perceives in marriage similar things, desires, what they want, what they expect from it. So I may call it like the white picket fence. We have great ideals and hopes for marriage, and everybody does, okay? But there's this recognition, if it's a capstone, that a lot of people can't earn it, right? Because, they didn't go to college, they didn't finish college, his job isn't stable enough, he's a little crotchety. And so marriage rates shrink, especially among the poor and the working classes, because they feel like, I'm not really marriage material. They might want to be. At the same time as this is occurring, women no longer need marriage culturally or economically in order to thrive. So they're being more selective about a mate. He's being a little bit more selective about a mate, but he's also sort of inwardly thinking, do I merit marriage? Am I good enough? Do I make enough money? Can I display enough wealth for someone to say, oh, I would love to be with that guy, right? So some of this change, I'd say a good chunk of this change has been about our mentalities around marriage, not so much about the realities of marriage. Because if marriageability was all about money, if you look around the West, including Romania, I mean, sure, there's economic downturns and upswings, but the world is far less poor than it once was. When I was a kid, 40 years ago, a great deal of the world Americans looked at as just generically poor. And that's no longer the case. There's thriving middle classes in probably every nation, and certainly in most. So it can't be about the unaffordability of marriage as a reason. That's a mentality that we now have. So it's no longer a matter of like, oh, men's wages and employment security fluctuate too much. No, I mean, that happens, but it's not about that anymore. It's not exclusively about that. We inhabit a very individualistic or atomistic atmosphere around marriage and relationships that fosters high material expectations for marriage, psychological expectations of great happiness that can't possibly be realized when we're talking about a relationship between a regular man and a regular woman, right? Social interaction breeds conflict, and it's the closest you'll get to a sociological law. So what it has fostered is an epidemic of uncertainty. There's a whole chapter in the book I talk about uncertainty, where people have a lot more options than they used to. I mean, one of the things that's remarkable, and nobody wants to go back to the communist era, but there was a stability to that era I noticed in Poland that fostered an easier time with marriage and friendships, such that now in this very free market orientation, we find ourselves having more difficult times getting married, staying married, finding and keeping friendships long term. The answer is not a return, but it's to recognize that we've kind of let free market mentalities infuse our households and our relationships such that we come to devalue these elemental institutions that have been so good to Western society and to the flourishing of human beings for millennia. So this is the thing that we're at right now. We have people who are more anxious than they used to be. We have more temptations, more choices. But you would think that, in theory, committing to another human being, right? A man committing to a woman, vice versa, should diminish our uncertainty, okay? If you are uncertain, put a ring on it, right? And that should, make something sure. But people don't think about it that way. Uncertainty seems to just grind us to a halt. Delay is far more common now into the later 20s, early 30s than is acceleration. Now, some of this has to do, in a book I wrote before this, to kind of the introduction of sexual relationships much earlier in adult relationship development than is ideal. So this has sort of made the what I call the sexual market much more uneven and favors men more than women in a way that sort of did not do so prior to the advent of wide contraception. So for example, my grandparents on my mother's side, they get married 1928 because my grandmother is pregnant with my oldest uncle. A very common scenario in much of human history. Okay, that is almost unheard of today, really, because relationships become sexual, but children don't appear. But the power dynamics of slow marriage down, because in some ways she has traded away a rather valuable asset to the acceleration of a relationship for the promise that he'll stay interested. But then he doesn't, he's not so, no rush, right? So all of these things are kind of, we have the capstone thing going on. We have cheap sex going on. We have women don't need men. Men are pickier about women. And so all of this has combined to create an atmosphere that just does not press people forward in developing relationship maturity and confidence about marriage. I'll stop there. I've said plenty.
Yes, well, thank you. Let me go ahead and I want to take advantage of you being with us tonight, Dr. Regnerus, because I want to bring in maybe two different concepts which we haven't planned to discuss yet. I just want to mention them to you, and maybe you can think about these concepts while I do a brief summary of what you just explained. I want to talk with you about this phenomenon, which is, I think, to some extent related to the fact that marriage is in a decline all over the world. The Guyland phenomenon. Have you heard of this concept?
I mean, it's the name of a book, or at least the title of a book, written by a sociologist of gender who got himself in a bit of trouble recently, but and squabbled with me intellectually, if I recall. But yeah, I could talk briefly about that, sure.
Yeah, because he had also noticed that people nowadays have a difficult time growing up, becoming adults, and somehow that ties in with your theme of a declining marriage. And then, of course, being Christians, we would like to get your input on the future of Christianity, the decline in Christian marriage. How does that impact or could impact the future of marriage? So we'll get back to those two topics in a couple of minutes. Deci, dragilor, vreau să menționez câteva din punctele pe care le-a explicat domnul profesor privind motivele care au dus sau cauzele care au dus la declinul căsătoriei chiar și între creștini. Afirmă dânsul că motivele sunt similare cu motivele care le găsim în lumea seculară. De exemplu, spunea dânsul, femeile au devenit mai independente decât erau acum 100 de ani, 50 de ani. Femeile sunt de asemenea mult mai educate în aceste zile decât erau acum 100 de ani. Și de asemenea vorbea despre influența, spunea dânsul, market impact, the free market mentality, adică mentalitatea pieței libere în care căutăm să fim avantajați în relațiile noastre unii cu alții și ca atare poate am devenit prea pretențioși, bărbații caută prea mult să-și găsească o soție, prea multe, știu eu, caută perfecțiune, un produs perfect într-o femeie, femeia de asemenea caută un produs de asemenea perfect într-un bărbat și această căutare pe piața căsătoriei, dacă vreți, nu e suficient doar educația soțului sau ocupația soțului. De asemenea, bărbații se uită la femei, la logodnice sau la tinere, care este educația, care este ocupația, ce venit poate să ducă în familie și așa mai departe. Deci, din aceste motive, dânsul spune, observăm, conform studiilor dânsului, și acest lucru are un impact asupra căsătoriei, a vârstei de la care se căsătoresc tinerii în ziua de astăzi. De asemenea, spune că și înțelesul căsătoriei ca instituție socială s-a schimbat și se schimbă din nou sub influența factorilor seculari. Înțelesul căsătoriei nu mai este un bărbat și o femeie se unesc în căsătorie, sacralitatea căsătoriei și aduc pe lume copii și duc mai departe următoarele generații, dar înțelesul căsătoriei este împlinirea personală. Bărbatul vrea să fie satisfăcut în toate dimensiunile lui, fie că este vorba de viața intimă, fie că este vorba de viața economică, fie că este vorba de viața emoțională. Femeile la fel, pe bună dreptate, vor să fie împlinite din toate punctele de vedere, din punct de vedere profesional, economic, al carierei, al soțului, educației și așa mai departe. Un lucru care de asemenea dânsul a menționat are de a face cu faptul că în ziua de astăzi creștinii, la fel ca și persoanele necreștine sau seculare, au alte alternative și opțiuni. Societatea seculară ne pune la dispoziție parteneriatele civile, uniunile civile, ceea ce înseamnă că nu mai trebuie să fii căsătorit în ziua de astăzi, poți doar să trăiești în concubinaș cu o altă persoană, fie de același sex, fie de sex opus, iar societatea tinde să îți dea totuși beneficiile sociale și beneficiile economice legale pentru că trăiești într-o relație de concubinaj. În alte cuvinte, dânsul vorbea despre acest capstone, adică ideea că în vârful societății există un ideal suprem și sub acest ideal suprem trăim cu toții și aspirăm cu toții la acest ideal suprem, care în opinia dânsului până acum câteva generații de oameni era familia, era căsătoria, relația de familie și relația de căsătorie. Dar acest nivel scade tot mai mult și ajungem la punctul în care oamenii își pierd interesul în căsătorie și în viața de familie. Un alt lucru despre care dânsul vorbea este un fenomen economic care afectează căsătoria. A intrat și în această psihologie a creștinilor noțiunea că pentru a te putea căsători, pentru a putea intra într-o relație de familie și căsătorie, trebuie să ai bani. De aceea dânsul ne dădea ca exemplu în Statele Unite situații în care oamenii săraci, oamenii needucați trăiesc în concubinaj mai mult decât oamenii mai înstăriți, oamenii cu profesii, oameni educați, tocmai pentru că ei nu au resursele financiare să aibă o nuntă fastuoasă, să aibă o viață materială plăcută după căsătorie și preferă ca atare viața, concubinajul, conviețuirea decât familia. Dar dânsul de asemenea menționa că acum 100 de ani, de exemplu, chiar 50 de ani în urmă, creștinii nu gândeau în acești termeni. Pentru creștini, faptul că erai bogat, erai sărac, nu avea nicio influență asupra deciziei de a te căsători la o vârstă de vreme, tânăr sau la o vârstă mai avansată în viață. Mai sunt 2-3 subiecte care vrem să le discutăm în seara aceasta și apreciem faptul că încă sunteți cu noi și anume un subiect care este de interes pentru noi toți și anume dacă asistăm relația dintre căsătorie, familie și creștinism, viitorul creștinismului. Deci dacă familia și căsătoria creștină au un viitor mai puțin previzibil, dacă asistăm la un declin al căsătoriei și al familiei creștine, ne putem oare aștepta ca acest declin să aibă un impact asupra viitorului creștinismului la nivel național și la nivel mondial? Deci subiecte interesante, sperăm să mai aveți nițică răbdare cu noi și sperăm să încheiem în vreo 15-20 de minute. So, Dr. Regnerus, I made a brief summary of what you have explained, the causes of the decline in Christian marriage, and if we could address maybe one or the 2 points that I have raised right before I switched to Romanian.
So you're asking about Guyland.
Yeah, it's a very weird topic and subject. I have read that book actually myself, and it struck me that, and I can see that even in our small Romanian community here in Houston, in my church, young men sort of, what's marriage for? They sort of cluster together, play pool together, not that much interest in growing up fast.
Yeah. So there are aspects of what you just described that are certainly the case and widely so. A little bit different, perhaps, than like Michael Kimmel's thesis in Guyland. My impression of his thesis, not having read the book but only skimmed it and read reviews, is that it's kind of like the extension of the sort of fraternity model of men's relationships with each other further into adulthood, pushing off marriage. So one of the bottom line things I would dispute is that if Kimmel doesn't deal with the kind of the reality of cheap sex, and I don't know if he does, I suspect not, but I don't know, then he's missing a major piece of the puzzle, because sort of the wide and easy access to sex that is not yielding fertility or children is kind of a major slowdown motive for marriage. And not every man has to experience that to slow down, but like it can be caught up into a culture of young adulthood such that people feel like, well, there's no rush. The same thing happens actually independently of women when young men sort of take up pornography to a large extent. That's more readily kind of replicates the sexual experience better than it did, in the magazine era of my father and grandfather. And so if you can mimic that more closely, then sort of you've gotten some of the benefits of marriage without the sides that you're not sure about and you want to push off and delay. So, if Michael Kimmel, the author of the book, doesn't deal with this, again, I don't know, then he's missing a central factor in kind of like the marriage slowdown that we see throughout much of the West. So I do see kind of a generalized immaturity. I can see it up close. At the same time, a generalized immaturity does not necessarily predict an aversion to marriage, right? So I have a young man in my household who he has some maturing to do, but he also has a girlfriend who he is quite interested in for the long run, and he doesn't intend to wait till he's 30. Okay, so basically, like maturity for a little bit of maturity issues don't predict a disregard for marriage, and I think there's this presumption that that's the case for the average young man. It may be true among the masses, but they don't necessarily go hand in hand. But we certainly have created this culture characterized by the capstone mentality that just understands marriage now as something you do later. I started the book Cheap Sex. No, the book before that, but which was published in 2011. It's called Premarital Sex in America: How Young Americans Meet, Mate, and Fall in Love. Or I think that was how it was. Meet, mate, and think about marrying. That's it. And that started with a comment from an undergraduate who was secular, irreligious. And she just sort of said to me at the university one day that she's actually hoping to meet somebody to marry while she's in college. But she had to keep that quiet because other girls would think, something's wrong with her. And I thought, that's kind of sad. A university of thousands of young adults is the only time you'll be able to in person meet so many people and communicate with so many people. So it's quite a good place to meet a mate if you are looking for the right person and you're conducting yourself in a manner conducive to it. But people don't think that way anymore. What has changed is not sort of that we think very differently about what marriage actually is, but we think when marriage happens, oh, that's later now. We're not thinking about that in our 20s. So it's not men alone who are doing this. Women also think about this way. But women more than men are apt to problematize it, or at least more quickly than men are. So that's my take on Guyland. I'll leave it right there.
So let's talk now about the future of Christianity and the title says The Future of Christian Marriage, and I think that we can talk about the future of Christianity as it is tied to marriage. I have seen in the studies that you have made and other sociologists and other researchers that there is definitely a direct relationship between family and Christianity and the health of both. So I'd like to take you up on that.
Yeah. So I end the book with sort of some predictions about the future of Christian marriage. And, as you suggest, throughout the book, I highlight the close connection between the institution of marriage and family and the institution of Christianity. And frankly, it'd be the case for all of the monotheistic religions, that the family and religion kind of track together. And where you see secularization happen, it will always be accompanied by kind of a more troubled families, later marriage, higher breakup rates, etc., more sort of progressive and permissive sexual attitudes and conduct, because they kind of go hand in hand. So I wrote the book because I was discouraged about what I had learned in the book Cheap Sex. So it might sound like, oh, I'm discouraged about the future of Christian marriage. Not so much. Partly because I do think, we're not close to a turnaround yet. Marriage will continue to recede in these societies, but there's a resistance obvious among serious Christians, and that's going to become more visible. One of the things I endorse in the book, there's a chapter in the book where I talk about 8 things that you can do that people and groups can do that sort of boost or reinforce marriage. One of the things I notice, and I think are good steps, is like Christianity in different countries takes on sort of a cultural character that is often connected to aspects of that country. And I gave some examples in the book, but I'm sure Romania is the case too, where there's sort of a Romanian traditionalism or a love of country that we can also see in various characteristics of the Christian cultures there. And Romania, in my mind, is like mostly Orthodox and Catholic, with some sort of significant Protestant minorities. And you can correct me if I'm wrong with that. But these share in common kind of a love of culture, and a love of culture that is sort of a love of Christian culture as well. And where those things are reinforced, progressives will look and see it as sort of nationalistic. It need not be so. I tend to sort of see it as sort of people's experience of faith and country are often experienced in some of the same kinds of ways. And so whenever I see sort of these expressions of Christian culture, I think they tend to be good for the country's independence, but I also tend to think they're good for marriage and family. And I gave some examples in the book. So I think a resistance will become more evident as marriage rates decline, because Christians still care about this and still value it, and parents still track their children towards it. Insofar as parents have experienced breakups, divorce, etc., they will be more uncertain, and they'll caution their children, and they'll find reasons to tell their children to slow down, make sure this is the right person, there's no rush. So I find parents often give their young adult children advice that is a reflection of their own troubles and not necessarily of the possibilities for their children. So I see a lot. And so it's kind of a legacy of divorce. Not only has it kind of sullied the family, but it continues to kind of try to shape the families of the future, which is dangerous. One thing I think is not going to be a major problem, and people will probably be surprised at this, what we call the gender revolution, I think is going to overreach. Marriage, to put it mildly, will never be successfully, sustainably queered, as they say in the United States, and I'd say Her Majesty's former colonies, basically. Marriage is heteronormative by definition. At the core of marriage is from my observations, is an exchange relationship of sexual difference. And so that is self-limiting to any kind of ventures of civil same-sex marriage, etc., which, you know, you might think there's pent-up demand for it, but that demand in the United States seems to have come and gone. And I can't imagine seeing same-sex marriages in the United States becoming popular for the long run, whereas there is a natural institutional, deeply human move towards marriage among men and women. And so I think the gender revolution will overreach, and that same-sex marriage was always more about a cultural land grab than it ever was about a strong, deeply held desire to participate in the institution and what it is. I think they would like to take the institution and turn it to their interests. But you can't just take marriage and make it whatever you want it to be. Marriage is what it is. It's not so much changing as it is receding. People don't want it as much, or people want it later in life, but it's not really open to just sort of being manipulated and altered. Finally, and this will be my kind of parting remark, marriage is going to become more of a Christian thing in the future than it has been in the past, because Christians just plain want it more than other people, even though it is a natural institution that the world has known and benefited from. As people choose against it, Christians are going to choose against it less. So it's going to become associated with Christianity and monotheistic religion in general in the future. And so they better safeguard it, because it's going to be consonant with those faiths more in the future than we've seen up to this point. But I'm optimistic about the future of Christian marriage and the future of marriage in general, not because it's going to return anytime soon to sort of a dominant model, but because it will never disappear. These kinds of natural institutions don't. They can be neglected for a while among the masses. But if you look back, you know, in the 1920s in the Soviet Union, they had their sexual revolution. And they sort of they changed the law to not make marriage any more esteemed than any other kinds of relationship. And it was a disaster. And it was reversed by the early 30s because it wasn't working. You couldn't build either a communist or a capitalist society without the sort of healthy unions of man and woman. So yeah, I'll quit there.
I want to put on the screen, talking about the Soviet Union, I want to put on the screen this book. I do not know whether or not you have read it. Wilhelm Reich.
Selections of it, yes.
I'm sorry?
Selections of it, yes.
Yeah, it's called the Sexual Revolution, and he does talk about the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's official experimentation with the sexual revolution. They encouraged all sorts of alternate lifestyles.
Yeah.
But after about 3 or 4 years, the Soviet Union, the leaders realized that society was not going in the right direction. Dr. Regnerus, I do have some encouragement for you. I do not know whether or not you have followed the news that back in 2018, Romania actually held a national referendum on marriage, just like we did in Texas back in 2008, 2009. And I think that the Texas marriage constitutional amendment passed with a vote of, I think, 76 or so to 23, 24. Now in Romania in October 2012, we did have a national referendum on marriage. Unfortunately, for various reasons, the amendment did pass, but it was not actually included in the Constitution for some technical reasons. But I want to let you know that in Romania, a Christian country, about 3-point-something million people showed up and voted in that referendum. And approximately 95 of all the people who voted in that referendum voted in favor of preserving Christian marriage between a man and a woman in Romania's constitution. Now think about it for a second. We are talking about 2018 in Europe. We are not talking about, Nigeria or Uganda or, some other country. You are talking about Romania, right there in the more or less in the heart of Europe, if you consider Europe from Ireland all the way to the Urals. By 2018, Romania has been in the European Union for 11 years. And even so, take courage. Now, I encourage sociologists and Christian scholars in the United States really to look at this data as well, because it's fascinating. After 40, 50 years of communism, 30 years of intense secularization, Romania, we can say that this was like a national poll on marriage. And 95% of all Romanians said, no, we want Christian marriage in our country. I do have a final question for you, and I appreciate your patience. And by the way, people are writing here. I can see somebody from Germany writing, God bless you. So I convey to you their appreciation for being with me tonight and with all of us tonight. And let me go back to Romania and explain the last comments that you have made, brief summary. And I will come back, and I am very interested, and I think people in Romania would be interested as well, to find out and know how your Christian faith and your Catholic faith have impacted you and helped you shape your worldview the way it's been presented by you tonight. So I'll be back in about 2 or 3 minutes after I make a brief presentation in Romanian. Deci, dragilor, comentariile finale ale domnului profesor au avut de a face cu viitorul creștinismului, având în vedere că la ora actuală putem spune că trendurile nu ni sunt favorabile, pentru că există acest declin în căsătorie. Dânsul era de acord cu mine, cum spun și eu de mulți ani, familia și credința, creștinismul merg mână în mână. Când familia suferă, când căsătoria suferă ca instituție socială, suferă și creștinismul. Familia este instituția care promovează, care duce de la o generație la alta creștinismul și valorile creștine. Dânsul spunea că, într-adevăr, în ziua de astăzi observăm instituția căsătoriei în toată lumea este parcă în retragere, dar ceea ce spune dânsul, care încurajează, este că observăm de asemenea că în interiorul comunităților creștine din America și din alte țări există o reafirmare, un pushback, o relansare, o ofensivă împotriva acestor factori care șubrezesc familia creștină, și dânsul vede această rezistență de bun augur și crede că familia în cadrul comunităților creștine din toată lumea va primi un suflet nou, o răsuflare nouă, o renaștere al devotamentului creștinilor față de familie. Dânsul de asemenea spunea, și cu asta mi se pare dânsul a încheiat, a arătat mai mulți factori care au dus la declinul căsătoriei creștine, printre altele divorțul, printre altele și faptul că unii creștini adoptă modurile de viață din afară, din lumea seculară, inclusiv moravuri sexuale nepotrivite, necreștine, și acestea natural au un impact asupra dorinței și viabilității instituției căsătoriei la creștini. I-am explicat de asemenea domnului profesor că în România, anului 2018, românii au dovedit un atașament extraordinar față de familia creștină și față de căsătoria creștină. I-am spus că, cu toate că doar vreo 3 și ceva milioane de români s-au prezentat la vot, 94-95% dintre românii care au mers la vot au votat pentru familia creștină, pentru familia tradițională, naturală, și am recomandat dânsului și altor oameni de știință din Statele Unite, mai ales creștini, să studieze cazul României și să ia curaj, să aibă curaj și știind că în România, cu toate că România a trăit sub comunism 50 de ani, secularism 30 de ani, în Uniunea Europeană vreme de 11-12 ani până în 2018, românii și România încă este atașată valoric vorbind la familia naturală, familia tradițională. Deci putem avea un punct aproape final de discuție pe un ton pozitiv. Creștinismul are viitor în România pentru că cel puțin la ora actuală în România creștinii românii sunt atașați față de instituția căsătoriei. Întrebarea finală care am pentru domnul profesor, dânsul, cum spuneam la început, e creștin, e catolic și l-am rugat să ne spună care este sau care a fost rolul creștinismului, dar mai ales a catolicismului, la care dânsul subscrie, în formarea perspectivei privind viața și societatea pe care dânsul o împărtășește, cum vedeți, cu atâta pasiune și cu atâta curaj. Professor Regnerus, we are back. We're switching back to English. So I asked you a short while ago, and I already told the public, tell us how you became such a cultural warrior, if I may use that expression, and how Christianity has formed and fashioned your worldview.
That is, it's a good question. It has been the subject of great interest to people. I remember, I think it was, I don't know, maybe it was 2014. New York Times reporter called me up because he wanted to know, why am I writing this stuff and what does my Christian faith have to do with it? And it didn't seem to matter much what I told him. He was going to tell the story he wanted to say. So that's happened a few times. Well, people can say what they want and speculate as they wish. But to me, the story is fairly straightforward. My faith has always stimulated my interest in particular things. So being a Christian in general, one realizes that family matters and marriage matters. Doesn't make me want to defend them. I don't really see myself as defending an institution. I am a sociologist. I describe situations. As I said earlier, marriage is not going to disappear. It doesn't really require my defense. But I think, what I want to do is tell people what I see in the data. So my faith stimulates my interest in these matters. I like to say that, I'm fairly interested in Catholic social teachings. And I say to myself, why didn't I pick poverty or migration? That would make me so much more popular than sort of to talk about marriage and family.
Exactly.
But, different people have to talk about these things, and different people are drawn to different stuff. So it doesn't really affect my methodology, I don't think. I think I use fairly conventional methods. And it doesn't tempt me, faith doesn't tempt me to sort of be propagandistic about this stuff. My job, as I've always seen it, is to describe reality in its complexity. And so I've tried hard to do that. I think complexity in the study of marriage is not very valued right now. Politically, complexity is a non-starter. People want to make easy answers to things or create policy platforms. And I was like, we've got to wrestle with sort of that answers are always more complex than people prefer them to be. So wrapped up in that is sort of a persistent search for the truth, right? As a Christian, I want to know what is true. I'm not afraid of the truth. I'm not afraid at all of data that may appear to be contrary to what I have understood before. I'm not trying to hide anything. What I want to know is what's real, what's true. So what I find in this sort of, especially in the study of sexuality and parenting and this sort of thing, that there's the truth is in how people analyze data, not so much sort of what the data says. It's like I'm never afraid of what the data actually say. What I'm skeptical about quite often is how people analyze it, as I described before. So I want to know what the truth of things are. And finally, I mean, faith gives courage in difficult times. And I remember that in 2012, I took a fair amount of solace in faith to stand up and when one is sort of being maligned publicly, and not to respond in kind. I don't know if people recognize this, but you probably won't ever catch me saying comparable things to my opponents that they say to me, because I don't think that's how we're supposed to treat people. We're supposed to treat them with respect. Now, we can criticize methods, but I always try to make it about ideas, not about persons, because persons always merit, always deserve good treatment because they have dignity. We can criticize their efforts and their work, perhaps, but not the person themselves. So that's kind of how, in a nutshell, how I understand faith as affecting my work.
Excellent. If you can spare 5 more minutes, I would like to complete our conversation tonight. I want to give you some words of encouragement from my own experiences as well. Occasionally, I do get phone calls from some publications. Even the New York Times has called me a couple of times in my career. I do get phone calls from LA Times occasionally. Usually they're international journalists or whatever, dealing with issues in Europe and family and values and so on and so forth. I also get phone calls once in a while from graduate students in the United States who are interested in Poland, in Romania, so on and so forth. And I can say that they have sort of the same reaction when they know that I'm a Christian, because, like you said, they are not that much interested in what they actually have to say. But the question that I'm getting as well is, why are you doing this? Why are you believing this? Don't you see that everybody else thinks differently? Only you are the odd man out. Why do you think differently? And so I'd like to encourage you, Professor Regnerus, just like I encourage myself when I do derive strength from the Word of God, the same through Word of God. And I do derive a lot of courage and encouragement and tenacity from the second book of Corinthians. I think it's chapter 4, where Apostle Paul says that he and the people around him were fools for Christ. At least I believe that's my calling. His times were tough, were difficult. Our times are tough and difficult, but we need to stand by, well, at least for myself, not giving lessons to anybody. I need to stand by the principles which I have learned from my parents and from the Word of God, which I hold to be true. Now that's the Baptist in me. So there you go. Let me make a few comments in Romanian. I will come back with a few comments in English, and then we will conclude for tonight. Dragilor, l-am întrebat pe domnul profesor să ne spună în câteva cuvinte impactul catolicismului, a credinței creștine și a învățăturilor catolice privind profesia dânsului și devotamentul care îl are față de valori. Și mi-a spus că, fără îndoială, credința dânsului ca și creștin și în mod special gândirea socială a Bisericii Catolice l-a influențat și continuă să-l influențeze în ceea ce alege să studieze, în ceea ce alege să promoveze prin talentul și intelectul pe care le-a dat Dumnezeu. Spunea dânsul, puteam să mă aleg subiecte mai ușoare, sărăcia sau alte lucruri de genul acesta, dreptatea socială, subiecte pe care dacă alegi, toată lumea te bate pe umăr și spune ești băiat bun. Dar în momentul în care alegi subiecte, la fel ca și mine, valorile creștine într-o lume decadentă, în declin din punct de vedere moral, toată lumea sau lumea seculară te arată cu degetul, ești un paria, oaia neagră și ești disprețuit. Dânsul de asemenea spunea în final că primește curaj, are tărie, tenacitate în ceea ce face, mai ales când este atacat din Cuvântul lui Dumnezeu. Cuvântul lui Dumnezeu, credința creștină îi dă mult curaj. Revin iarăși în limba engleză să-i mulțumesc invitatului și după aceea un mic anunț în limba română și după aceea vom încheia și vă mulțumim. Professor Regnerus, what can I say? It's been a tremendous evening. I have enjoyed being your student in a sense tonight, and I have learned a lot. And folks, we have had additional subjects that the professor and I wanted to talk about tonight, but we didn't have the time. You have listened to us for about 2 hours and 15 minutes. We thank you, whether or not you listen to us for 5 minutes or 50 minutes or 2 hours. We thank you, we appreciate you. And again, Dr. Regnerus, we appreciate you very much. We look forward to having you actually in Romania.
That'd be great. I'd be happy to go.
In person. I know that we talked about that. Let's see what the future holds. I have a habit, a custom at the end of every live that I do. I present, I suggest a book to those in Romania, usually in the English language, a recent publication, and I encourage them to read this book, purchase the book and read the book. And so tonight I'm going to recommend to them a book in Romanian, and then we are going to be done. Dragi români, vreau să pun pe ecran o carte care nu neapărat are ceva de a face cu valorile creștine, dar este o carte care are de a face cu un erou național, un român extraordinar, și anume Emil Racoviță. Acum o lună sau cam așa ceva a fost publicată, mi se pare în Marea Britanie, nu, în Statele Unite a fost publicată cartea aceasta, Madhouse at the End of the Earth. E vorba despre expediția pe care Emil Racoviță a făcut-o împreună cu alți cercetători la Polul Sud. Am uitat anul exact când, dar cartea aceasta conține niște informații extraordinare despre marele român care a fost Emil Racoviță și care a supraviețuit, a rămas în viață prin mila lui Dumnezeu și a lăsat în urmă niște manuscrise extraordinare care sunt folosite în mod extensiv pentru a scrie cartea aceasta din partea profesorului american Julian Sancton. Deci, cu aceste gânduri, vă spunem noapte bună, la revedere. And again, Dr. Regnerus, we thank you. We are happy that you have been with us. Absolutely honored. And I can tell you that millions of Romanians would love to see you in Romania. And I would like to invite you to just bring me up, call me when you publish a book or some important study that you would like for the Romanian public to know about. I'll be more than happy to spend time with you again on my Facebook page. Thank you everyone and good night. La revedere, noapte bună, ne vedem cu voia lui Dumnezeu într-o săptămână.
Thanks, Peter.
You. Yes, sir.